So this section is going to be on the Roaring Twenties, looking at a couple specific spots. So the first thing that I wanted to start talking about was seeing red. So the Americans in the 1920s had turned their sights inward. So they weren't looking outside so much. They weren't paying too much attention to foreign affairs. They were kind of trying to figure out what it meant to be an American at that point. So they were shutting down diplomatic commitments to foreign countries. They were denouncing radical figure ideas, such as Marxism, condemning un-American lifestyles, and they shut the immigration gates against foreigners, slowly but surely. The boom of the 1920s had also had effects and many benefits. So with this comes new technologies like radios that could be placed in the home, which brought about new consumer products, things that were mass produced that were easy for middle America to buy and keep in their homes. And along with this came newer forms of leisure. So you had going to the movies, you could go to Coney Island for the day, different things that were getting people out of the house more that they wouldn't have done previously. Along with this time period are the hysterical fears of Red or Communist Russia, followed by the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. This was a communist revolution, and the tensions were heightened by an epidemic of strikes that convulsed the republic at the war's end. And because of these strikes, Americans jumped to the conclusion that the Bolsheviks had fermented labor troubles, which is what brought about the communist revolution. However, it was a combination of many different things, but that's what Americans tended to focus on, which is why in the 1920s and further on through the 60s, 70s, unions and things like that, and these union strikes and boycotts were heavily associated with communist ideals in the eyes of Americans and were commonly frowned upon by various political figures. Along with the Bolshevik Revolution came the Big Red Scare from about 1919 to about 1921 in America. This was a nationwide crusade against left-wingers whose Americanism was suspect, and because of this, alien radicals were deported. So this was something that was mainly an ideal. So it's very hard to separate clear evidence from going off of an idea. So this was very controversial, but times of fear bring about times of they bring about times of action that aren't necessarily well thought out. Due to this, there's the anti-redism and anti-foreignism that comes about in America, which are reflected in various notorious cases. These were called judicial lynchings. So an example of this is the case of Sacco and Vanzetti. They were Italians, and they were Italian immigrants who were accused of a murder after a robbery. They were quickly accused off of the basis of very suspect evidence, and that being that it was ballistic evidence to a gun who they weren't really sure if the gun even belonged to either of the men. But because they were considered guilty, they were quickly executed and electrocuted, which brought about many different views in America over whether or not these men were rightfully tried or not, whether or not they were actually guilty of the crime. And many people, even still today, think that because of the lack of evidence and because of the lack of correlation, that these two men were tried basically solely on race rather than on true hard evidence. Along with this idea of immigrant worries in the United States, the United States began to slowly close the gates on foreign immigration. So immigrants began to flood the country as peace settled in the 1920s, and some 800,000 stepped ashore in 1920 to 1921, two-thirds of those from Southern and Eastern Europe. Congress decided that this wasn't okay and started to plug the breach with the various acts. One of these is the Emergency Quota Act of 1912, where newcomers from Europe were restricted in any given year to a definite quota. So these quotas would range year by year. And the requirements for this were that 3% of the people of their nationality who had been living in the U.S. In 1910 had to be there in order for these people to come over. And this was very favorable to Southern and Eastern Europeans who didn't have very many people who were living in the United States at the time. This continued with the Immigration Act of 1924, which replaced the Act of 1921, and where the quotas were cut from 3% to 2%, and the national origins base, so what these percentages were based off of, shifted to the census of 1890 instead of 1910. And these quota systems were a departure in American policy. So Americans who have been built up by immigration started to see immigration dwindle to a mere trickle. There were fewer and fewer Southern Europeans who had arrived. The door shut completely for Japanese immigrants, and the only ones who were exempt to these quota systems were Canadians and Latin Americans.